While on jQuery Air, you'll arrive super quick. With our in-flight service, you'll learn code with a click. Yes, now all this and more, taught by Greg Pollock. We hope you enjoy your flight.
I'm Greg, and I'll be your captain this evening on jQuery Air.
Welcome to jQuery Air 2. I'm Greg Pollock, and in this level, we're going to be first doing a little bit of a review on selectors to make sure we're on the same page. We're then going to talk about namespacing using the $, data tags, binding events, unbinding events, and then finally we'll talk about live and delegate. So we're going to start out looking at some HTML, and then we're going to run some selectors against it. You may notice that this HTML has a HTML5 data tag. We can use this data tag to store variables and little pieces of data that we might want to use later in our jQuery. To get the first item in this list, we would use this jQuery code here. It would return the link. If we wanted to get the text of that link, we could do this, and it would return September 27th. To get the href of the link, we could call attribute href, and we get back this. And then finally, if we wanted to get the value of the data tag, we could call data flights, and that would return 6. What we're going to be building together in this level is something that looks like this. It's a little flight reservation page. So here you can hover over each of the tabs and it tells you how many flights are available on that day. And if I want to see the flights on that day, I can click on that tab and then we'll go and fetch the flights and show me what's available for that day along with prices. So let's start building. So here's the HTML that we saw a second ago with all the dates that we have flights for. Let's write some jQuery. We want this to run only when the document object model is ready. We're going to say for each link, prevent default, so we don't want it to follow that link. Then let's remove the active class from the tab that's currently active, and let's add it to the class that we clicked on. We can clean up this code a little bit. We're going to take some of this code and wrap it in a function called changeTab. Then our click event is simply going to call that function. Instead of using document ready, we're going to use a slightly different syntax that looks like this. What this does is it executes the DOM when it's loaded, just like document ready, but it also ensures that that $sign is sort of namespaced to the jQuery object. So if we're using other JavaScript frameworks that also use that $sign, here we're going to make sure that the code inside here, that $sign, refers to jQuery. So let's jump into the browser, and you can see here we can click on each of the tabs and it properly gets selected. But we might also want a default tab. Maybe that middle one, September 29th. Let's make that the default. So when we call up the page for the first time, that's already selected. The way we're going to do that is simply by grabbing that link and calling the click event on it. You'll notice here I'm using a different selector you might not have seen before, EQ2. That's going to select the third element. The first tab would be EQ0, the second tab would be EQ1, and the third tab, which we want, is EQ2. So here you can see in the browser, September 29th is selected by default. We can click off of that, and whenever we refresh the page, it's going to select September 29th again. Next up, we're going to use that data flights attribute so that we can create a tooltip. So when we hover over each of the tabs, it'll show us how many flights are available for that date. We want the tooltip to look a little bit something like that, so let's take a look inside of our code. You can see here we have our normal click event. We already went over that. We're also going to add a mouse enter event, which we'll call the show number of flights function, and a mouse leave event, which calls the hide number of flights function. So first of all, in the show number of flights function, we're going to grab the number of flights out of the data attribute. Then we're going to append a span with the number of flights in it. For the hide number of flights function, all we're going to do is call remove on the tooltip. So just remove that element. We can refactor this code a little by using the bind command. Since all of these events are happening on the same element, we can write it like this. So we just say bind, and then we have a list of all the events. In the browser, here's what our tooltip is going to look like. So you can see here we hover over each of the tabs, and it tells us how many flights are available. So we have tabs, but we need to add some divs where we put the flight data. So let's go ahead and write them out, as you can see here. Right now we're just going to put loading text in each of them. You'll notice that the href matches the ID of the divs down below. This is no coincidence. We're going to be using that in just a minute. Let's shrink down our HTML and make some room for our jQuery. Here's our change tab function. We've already walked through this code, but now we're going to add a hide call to hide all of the divs. And then we're going to find the active div by looking up the attribute on the link that was just clicked. And we're going to use that to find which div we should be showing. We're going to refactor this code a little bit by creating a showFlights function. We'll just send in the active div to the showFlights function, and that'll hide all the divs and show the one that's active. So if we jump into our browser at this point, we can see that as we click the tabs, it properly shows the div that we're looking at. Pretty cool. So we're selecting the proper divs, but we don't have the flight data in there yet. We want to be able to load that in, and we want to load it using Ajax, but we're not going to cover Ajax until the next level. So for now, we're just going to call the showFlights method, and that's going to load in the proper flights. So let's jump back into the browser. So now we have flights, and we can click on each of the tabs to select the flights. Pretty cool. You'll notice, though, that if I click a tab, every time I click the tab, even if it's the active tab, it's going to do another call back to the server, another Ajax call, which isn't so good. To stop the event from happening, we're going to learn how to use the unbind function. So here you can see I'm getting the active link, and I'm unbinding the click event on it. Since I'm unbinding the event, when I click off of that tab, I'm going to want to rebind it. So I'm simply going to add click change tab. It should be said that this is the same thing as saying bind click change tab. It does the same thing, just different syntax. So if we go back into our browser now, we can see that when we click on a tab and keep on clicking on that tab, it doesn't cause an Ajax request to happen every time. Pretty cool. When you're binding events, you should know that you can namespace each of these events. Here you can see I'm namespacing click, so I'm just giving it an extra .flight schedule name. Then when I want to unbind it, I have to reference that same name. Alternatively, I could add that namespace to all of the different events. If I did this and I wanted to unbind all those events all at once, I could simply call unbind.flight schedule. The next piece of functionality we want to add is the ability to select an individual price, to basically pick out the flight and pick out if we want to do first class or coach. And as we click on a different one, that one should get selected. Here's what the HTML looks like on our flights table. You can notice that one of these has class selected, and that's what's going to highlight that particular flight. Let's jump into the jQuery to make this work. So here we're going to bind on the click action. It's going to call the select flight function. Inside of the select flight function, we're going to prevent default. We're then going to remove the selected class from the one that's currently selected. Then we're going to add the selected class to the one that we just clicked on. If we jump into our browser and try this out, we'll notice that it doesn't seem to work. We're clicking on stuff and nothing's getting highlighted. That's because we shouldn't be using the bind function. What we should be using is the live function. Because we're loading in that flight data dynamically using Ajax, we need to have it look for that event, no matter what's on the page. What bind does is it goes through, it only hooks onto that event one time. What live does is it looks for that selector, and whenever it finds that, whether it's now or in the future, it's going to properly catch that event and call the right function. So if we jump back into our browser, we can now click on the different prices and select our flights. Using live, like we showed you there, turns out to be not such a good practice. There's a better way to bind events. Live, this line up here, is the same as saying document delegate. Okay. So what that document delegate thing is saying is on the document, the highest level document, look for the click event that matches this selector. And so like every time the click happens, it's going to be trying to match at sort of the top event level, which isn't so good. We can fine-tune this command by giving it the selector that we want to be checking inside for the click event on the flight link. There are two benefits to using delegate. First of all, it can be method chained, so you can have a bunch of methods all up against each other. And secondly, as I mentioned before, it also performs faster because it only has to be checking for that event, for that element in this part of the code instead of the entire document as using live does. That about does it for level 1 of jQuery Air 2. I hope you're ready to get your hands dirty with some of the code challenges. Good luck.